A basket hit the mud and the eggs burst open in the road. A frail old woman went down after it, both knees in the filth, her hands shaking as she reached for what was already ruined. Laughter rolled over her. A boot nudged the basket further away. Someone flicked a coin at her back and told her to dance for it. Nobody moved to help. Nobody except one woman at the edge of the square, wide-hipped and out of breath, who shoved straight through the crowd and dropped to her knees in the mud beside her. That was Prudence Hartwell. She wrapped her shawl around the stranger's shoulders and gathered the broken eggs with her bare hands. She did not know who this old woman was. By morning, the most feared man in 3 counties stood at her door. What did he want? Stay with me on this one. Prudence Hartwell was not the sort of woman people looked at twice. She was broad in the shoulder and wide at the hip, and she carried herself like someone who had spent her whole life being laughed at. In the town of Ashford-on-Wye, the gentry had a dozen cruel names for a woman her size, and they used every one of them. She had learned long ago to keep her eyes down and her needle moving. You get a thick skin that way, or you get no skin at all and the world flays you. Prudence had chosen the thick skin. Most days it held, because that was her trade. She was a seamstress, and a fine one, though nobody with money would ever say so out loud. She turned collars and let out seams for ladies who would not meet her eye in the street. She lived in a single room above a chandler's shop, with a narrow bed, a work table by the window, and a one-eyed sheepdog named Barnaby who slept across her feet every night of the year. It was not much of a life, if you counted it the way the world counts. But she had her work and she had her dog and she owed no one an apology, and there were plenty in that town who couldn't say the same. Now, here's the thing about Barnaby. He'd lost that eye to a farmer's boot as a pup, thrown out in a ditch to die, and Prudence had carried him home in her apron. From that day, he never left her side. He was old now, gray around the muzzle, but he still had teeth, and he still knew the difference between a friend and a threat. That morning in the square, when the crowd closed in on the old woman, Barnaby had planted himself in front of her and growled low until the jeering men stepped back. A one-eyed dog and a fat seamstress. That was all that stood between an old woman and a crowd that wanted a bit of sport. And do you know, it was enough. Sometimes it only takes one soul refusing to look away. The old woman didn't say much as they walked. She was small and thin, with white hair coming loose beneath a plain bonnet, and hands that trembled even when they rested. When Prudence had gathered the eggs, only 3 had survived the fall. 3 out of a dozen. The old woman stared at them, and her lips shook. "They'll be angry with me," she whispered. "I've lost the rest." "Nobody's going to be angry," Prudence said. "Lean on me, I've got you, there now." They went slow through the back lanes, away from the market and the laughing men. Prudence kept her arm around the woman's shoulders the whole way, and Barnaby walked on the other side like a soldier on guard. The old woman pointed them down a long road that led out past the edge of town, toward the hills, and Prudence thought that a strange thing, an old woman walking so far alone with a heavy basket, but she didn't ask. It wasn't her business. She'd learned that too over the years. Everybody's carrying a load you can't see. You lend a hand with the one that's showing and you leave the rest be. What she did notice was how cold the woman was, shaking, half from fright and half from the wind. So Prudence stopped, unwound her own shawl, the gray wool one she'd knitted 3 winters back and mended more times than she could count, and tucked it around the woman's thin shoulders. "You keep that," she said. "I couldn't." "You can and you will. I run warm, always have. It's one of the few gifts of being built like me." And she laughed at herself, easy and kind, so the old woman would feel free to laugh too. That was a trick she'd taught herself young. Laugh first, laugh loudest, and the world's laughter can't cut you. The old woman managed a small smile, the first Prudence had seen on her, and something about it near broke her heart, because it was the smile of a person who'd forgotten she was allowed to. They came at last to a small gate, and the old woman said she could manage from there. Before she let her go, Prudence looked at the 3 lonely eggs in that basket and knew they wouldn't feed a bird. So she reached into her apron pocket and took out the last coins she had in the world, 2 shillings and a few pennies. Money she'd meant for her own bread that week. "Here, buy yourself a proper loaf and something hot," she said, folding it into the woman's trembling hand. "And mind you eat it. All of it." The old woman looked at the coins, then up at Prudence's plain, red, kind face, and something moved behind her eyes that Prudence didn't understand. "Why," the woman said softly, "would you do this? You don't even know my name." Prudence just shrugged. "Didn't need your name to see you were cold and frightened. That's enough for me. Get on in now, mind the step." And she never did ask. That's the part you have to hold on to. She walked home with empty pockets and a bare neck in the wind, and she never learned who that old woman was. To Prudence, she was just someone who needed help on a bad day. Nothing more. She thought that was the end of it. Believe me, it was only the beginning. The trouble started before she even reached her own door. Standing at the bottom of the stairs, waiting, was Silas Kroll. And if you'd lived in Ashford-on-Wye, that name alone would have turned your stomach. Kroll was the richest cloth merchant in town. He owned the building Prudence lived in, and he owned the contracts that gave her most of her work, and he owned, in the way that such men always seemed to, half the people who owed him money and were afraid of him. He was the one who had flicked that coin at the old woman's back in the square. He was the one who'd started the crowd laughing. And now he'd watched a fat seamstress shame him in front of the whole town. "Well," he said, "the great lady returns, kneeling in the muck with the beggars. Making a spectacle." His voice was quiet, which was worse than shouting. "Do you know what you did today, Hartwell? You made me look a fool in my own square." "I helped an old woman up out of the mud, Mr. Kroll. That's all I did." "You made me look small." He stepped closer. "In front of the Fairfaxes, in front of the magistrate's wife. People remember a thing like that. People talk." He let the silence sit. "So here's what's going to happen. That order of shirts you've been stitching for me, the officer's linen, worth more than you'll earn in a year, I'm giving it to the weaver girl on Mill Lane. And the 2 dresses the alderman's wife left with you, I'll have them collected in the morning. You'll not touch my custom again. Not you." Prudence felt the floor drop out from under her. That linen order was her whole winter. Without it she couldn't pay him the rent on the room, and without the room she had nothing. He knew it. That was the point. A man like Kroll never struck at your face. He struck at your bread and your roof and the thin margin between you and the street, because that was where a poor woman had no defense at all. "Please," she said, and she hated the sound of her own voice begging. "Mr. Kroll, I've given you honest work for 6 years. Whatever you think I did to you today, it was to a poor old woman I never met. Don't take my living for it." "I'm not taking anything," he smiled. "I'm simply choosing where to spend my money. That's a man's right, isn't it? You should have thought about that before you decided to play the saint." He turned to go, then paused. "The rent's due Friday, same as always, I'll expect it." And he walked off whistling. That was the detail that stayed with her, the sound of a man well pleased with a day's work, strolling off into the dusk, having decided, on a whim, over nothing to break her. She climbed the stairs on shaking legs. Inside, she sat down at her work table and did not light the candle for a long while. Barnaby put his gray head in her lap and she stroked his ears and tried to work out the sums, and the sums did not work. There was no order. There was no shilling in her pocket, because she'd given her last coins to a stranger. There was rent due Friday and nothing to pay it with. She counted it 3 times in the dark, the way you do, as if the 3rd time the numbers might take pity on you and come out different. They never do. She'd been foolish, some voice inside her said. She should have kept her head down like always. She should have let the old woman be. What was one more unkindness in a town that ran on them? But then she thought of that thin hand in hers and the way the woman had asked why, and she found she couldn't be sorry. Not really. Being sorry would have meant she'd do it differently, and she knew, plain as her own name, that she wouldn't. You are what you do when it costs you. She'd worked that out a long time ago, and she wasn't about to unlearn it now, not for Silas Kroll, not for rent, not for anything. So she did what she always did when the world pressed down. She lit the candle at last, threaded her needle, and began to mend her own torn apron, because a body has to keep her hands busy or the fear gets in. Outside the window the town went quiet and dark. Barnaby sighed and stretched out across her feet. The panic in her chest slowed to a dull, tired ache, and she told herself the thing that poor people have always told themselves to get through the night. Tomorrow. Tomorrow she'd walk every street in town and find someone, anyone, who'd give a good seamstress a bit of work. Kroll wasn't the only man in Ashford with a torn coat. She'd manage. She always had. By the time she blew out the candle, she'd near talked herself calm. The worst had come and gone, she thought. Losing the work was hard, but it was done, and a body can bear a thing once she knows the shape of it. She lay down in the dark with her dog warm against her side and let herself believe the storm had passed. She had no idea. The storm hadn't even started. It was the sound of hooves that woke her. Not one horse. Many. And carriage wheels, iron-rimmed, grinding to a stop in the narrow lane below her window, where no carriage that fine had any business being. Prudence sat up in the gray light before dawn. Barnaby was already at the window, ears up, that low growl building in his chest. She looked down into the lane and her blood went cold. It was a black carriage, huge and polished, pulled by 4 black horses, with 2 liveried outriders and a crest on the door she didn't recognize but instantly feared, because a crest like that meant power, real power, the kind that could crush a woman like her without noticing. Doors were opening up and down the street, faces appearing at windows, and there, already gathering at the mouth of the lane, drawn by the noise, was half the town, Silas Kroll among them, and on his face a look of pure, greedy delight. The carriage door opened. A man stepped down. He was tall, dressed head to foot in black, a long, dark coat, riding boots, no ornament on him anywhere, and that somehow made him more frightening, not less. His face was hard and still. He looked up at Prudence's window as if he already knew exactly which one was hers, and every person in that lane went silent at once, because they knew him. Of course they knew him. This was Alaric Thorne, the Duke of Ravenscar, the coldest, most feared man in 3 counties. They said he'd turned a family out into the snow for a debt. They said he'd never smiled once since his father died. They said a great many things, and the only thing everyone agreed on was that you did not want the Duke of Ravenscar knowing your name, and he had come to Prudence Hartwell's door. Kroll understood it before anyone. That old woman in the square, that beggar Prudence had made such a fuss over, must have been someone's servant, someone under the Duke's protection, and now the Duke had come to punish the fat seamstress who'd caused a scene. Kroll's mouth curled into a grin. He couldn't have arranged a sweeter revenge if he'd paid for it. "Come down," the Duke said. He did not shout, he didn't need to. "Prudence Hartwell, come down." Her legs barely held her on the stairs. Barnaby went first, growling, putting himself between his mistress and the whole cold morning. When she stepped out into the lane in her plain dress with her hair undone, the crowd drew a breath as one. She was going to be ruined. Anyone could see it, perhaps worse than ruined. Men like the Duke could have a woman like her thrown in a cell and forgotten. She lifted her chin the best she could and walked out to meet him. If she was going to be destroyed, she'd not do it cowering. "You're the woman from the market square yesterday," the Duke said, looking down at her. "The one who knelt in the mud." "I am, my lord," her voice shook. Whatever's to be done, do it to me and no one else. There's nobody else to blame. It was my doing." Something crossed the Duke's hard face. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and the whole town held its breath waiting for the blow to fall. "The old woman you helped," he said at last. "The one you gave your shawl to. The one you gave your last coins to and walked all the way home and never once asked her name." His voice caught just slightly on the last words. "That woman is my mother, the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscar." The lane erupted. You could hear it move through the crowd like wind through wheat, the gasping, the whispering, Kroll's grin dropping clean off his face. And Prudence, poor Prudence, felt her knees go weak because she thought she understood. A duchess. She'd bossed a duchess up out of the mud. She'd forced her own coarse shawl on a duchess and told her to keep it. Surely that was a crime of some kind, laying hands on a great lady, and now this terrible man had come to make her pay for it. "My lord, I swear I didn't know," she said. "I never meant any disrespect. I only saw she was cold and frightened, and I—" "Stop!" The Duke held up a hand, and then the most feared man in 3 counties did something no one in that lane had ever seen him do. He bowed his head to a fat seamstress. "You have nothing to be sorry for," he said quietly. "I did not come here to punish you. I came to thank you." For a moment nobody breathed. Then the whole crowd stared, unable to believe their own ears, and Silas Kroll took a small, involuntary step backward because the ground he'd been standing on had just turned to nothing beneath his feet. If you've made it this far, and your throat's gone a little tight the way mine has telling it, do me one small kindness and hit that subscribe button. Stories like this one only find the people who need them when you do. Now, back to the lane and to the Duke and to what he said next. "Walk with me," the Duke said to Prudence, "please." That "please" was the strangest word any of them had ever heard from his mouth. He offered her his arm, and Prudence, hardly knowing what she did, took it, and they walked a little way down the lane together while the whole town watched, and Barnaby trotted stiff-legged at her heel, still not trusting a soul. "My mother is not well," the Duke said, low, so only Prudence could hear. "In her body and lately in her mind. Some days she is sharp as she ever was. Other days she forgets and she wanders. She dresses in an old servant's clothes and slips out past the gate, and she goes down into the towns because she says that at the manor everyone treats her like something made of glass. Everyone bows. Everyone fears her because they fear me. Nobody speaks to her like a person anymore." He stopped walking. "So she goes among strangers who don't know her face. And do you know what she finds there, Mrs. Hartwell?" "I can guess," Prudence said softly. "I saw it." "Cruelty," he said. "Every time. They see a poor old woman in worn clothes and they see something to laugh at. My men usually find her within the hour, but never before someone has mocked her, or shoved her, or worse. 60 years that woman has been a duchess, and men have bowed to her face and sneered the moment she turned her back." His jaw tightened. "I have spent my whole life learning to be feared, because I thought fear was the only thing that could keep the world from being cruel to the people I love, and it has never once worked. I could not protect my own mother from a market crowd. All my land, all my name, all the terror in 3 counties, and it could not buy her one kind word from a stranger who thought no one was looking." He turned and looked Prudence full in the face, and his cold eyes weren't cold at all now. They were wet. "Yesterday, for the first time in my life, my mother came home and she was not weeping. She was smiling. She sat by the fire wrapped in a gray wool shawl that didn't belong to her, and she told me a woman had knelt down in the filth beside her. A woman who shielded her from a jeering crowd with her own body, who gathered her broken eggs with bare hands, who gave her her own shawl off her back and her last coins out of her pocket and walked her the whole long way home." His voice broke and he let it. and who never once asked her name, who wanted nothing, who did not know she was a duchess, and would have done exactly the same if she'd been a beggar. Do you understand what that is worth to a son who has spent 30 years unable to give his mother one single hour of gentleness from a stranger? Prudence's own eyes had filled now. She couldn't speak. She just shook her head. "It is worth everything," the Duke said, "everything I have." He turned then to face the crowd, and the softness went out of him like a door closing, and the man they feared was back, taller and colder than before. "Which of you," he said, and his voice carried down every inch of that lane, "flicked a coin at my mother's back yesterday and told her to dance for it?" Silence, terrible silence, and every eye in that crowd, slow and helpless, turned toward Silas Kroll. Kroll's face had gone the color of ash. "My lord," he stammered, "I had no way of knowing who she was. I never dreamed. I meant no." "You did not know who she was." The Duke walked toward him unhurried. "That is precisely the point. You did not know, so you thought she was nobody, so you thought you could be cruel and it would cost you nothing. That is who you are, Kroll, when you believe no one important is watching." He stopped a pace away, looking down at him. "I have heard your name before this morning. I know how you run this town, the rents you raise on widows, the debts you call in. And I know what you did to this woman last night when you took her work away for the crime of showing my mother kindness. Yes, I know that too. It took me one evening to learn the shape of your whole small life. Imagine what a month will show me." Kroll's mouth opened and shut and made no sound. "So here is how it will be," the Duke said. "Every contract you hold I will be examining. Every lease on every building you own in this town I will have my lawyers read line by week's end. You have prospered a long time on the fear of small people who thought no one bigger cared what happened to them." He leaned in, quiet as a knife. "Someone bigger cares now. Go home, Mr. Kroll. Enjoy what's left of your comfort while it lasts." Kroll fled. There's no other word for it. A rich man of 50, near running, and the crowd parting to let him through, and not one soul lifting a hand to help him. That's the thing about men like that. Their power is borrowed, all of it, and the moment a bigger creditor comes to collect, there's nothing underneath but a frightened little man. Then the Duke turned back to Prudence, and the hardness fell away again. "Now," he said, "to you. And I'll not hear the word no, because I've had enough of that word for one life." He took a breath. "My mother has asked for you by the only name she had, the kind fat lady with the one-eyed dog. She wants you at Ravenscar, not as a servant, as her companion, her friend, someone to sit with her and walk with her and treat her like a woman and not like glass for whatever time she has left. And you will have your own rooms and a fair wage, more than fair, and your dog is welcome, and no one under my roof will ever say an unkind word to you as long as I draw breath, because they'll answer to me if they do." He paused. "Say yes, please. She hasn't asked for anyone in 3 years." Prudence stood in that lane in her plain dress with her hair undone and the whole town watching, and she began quietly to cry. Not from fear. She'd had her fill of fear. These were the other kind of tears, the kind that come when the world, just once, turns out to be kinder than you dared to hope. "Yes," she managed. "Of course, yes, I'll come. But my lord," she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, "I didn't do it for a wage. You know that. I'd have done it for nothing." "I did do it for nothing." "I know," said the Duke of Ravenscar. "That is the entire reason I am standing here." She rode to the manor in the great black carriage, with Barnaby's head in her lap and the town falling away behind her. And here is the part I like best, so let me tell it slow. The Dowager Duchess Eleanor was waiting on the steps when they came up the long drive. Small and thin, white hair neat now, wrapped in a gray wool shawl mended a dozen times. When she saw Prudence step down from the carriage, Her whole face opened like a window in spring. "You came," the old woman said. "You came, my dear." "Course I came," said Prudence. "Somebody's got to make sure you eat your bread. All of it mind." And the Duchess laughed, a real laugh, and reached out with both trembling hands and took Prudence's face between them. And Barnaby leaned his old gray body against the Duchess's knees and let her scratch his ears with a devotion he'd shown no living soul but Prudence in 13 years. The Duke stood back and watched the three of them, and something in his hard face that had been locked shut for 30 years came quietly, finally, unstuck. The days that followed were the gentlest Prudence had ever known, though she never got grand about them. That wasn't in her. She had her rooms, warm and dry, but she still rose early and still kept a needle by her, because a body needs work. She spent her hours with Alina. They walked the gardens when the old woman was strong and sat by the fire when she wasn't. On the good days the Duchess told stories of when she was young, of the dances and the dresses and the man she'd married. And on those days her eyes were bright and her voice was steady, and you'd never have guessed anything was wrong at all. On the bad days, when the mind went foggy and Alina forgot where she was and grew frightened, it was Prudence who held her hand and said, "You're safe, love. I've got you. I've got you," the very words she'd said in the mud that first morning. And the old woman would calm at the sound of them every time, even when she'd forgotten everything else. The town, of course, told the story 100 ways. How the fearsome Duke had knelt to a seamstress. How Silas Kroll lost his contracts one by one, and then his buildings until he sold what was left and moved off to somewhere no one knew his name. And the widows he'd bled found their rents halved and their debts forgiven because the Duke had bought up every last one and set them free. People said the Duke had changed, gone soft, some grumbled. But those who really knew, who'd stood in that lane, understood the truth of it. He hadn't gone soft. He'd simply been shown by a woman with nothing that there was another way to keep the people you love safe. Not fear. Kindness has a longer reach than fear. It just takes a braver soul to spend it. The Duchess lived another 11 months. Good months, mostly, the best of her last years, everyone agreed. And when she went in her own bed on a quiet spring evening, with her son on one side holding her hand and Prudence on the other, and Barnaby a warm weight across her feet, and the gray wool shawl, that plain, mended, worthless, priceless thing, tucked around her shoulders where it had stayed since the day it was given. Her last clear words were for Prudence. "You never asked my name," she whispered, smiling. "Do you remember? All you saw was that I was cold." "I remember," Prudence said. "It's all a body ever needs to see." Prudence stayed on at Ravenscar the rest of her days. The Duke, who had no other family left in the world, came to call her the truest friend he had, and meant it. And there are worse things to be than the one soul a lonely, frightened man learns he can trust. She opened a little school in the town for girls too poor to pay, seamstresses and servants' daughters, and she taught them their letters and their stitches, and one thing more besides, the thing she believed above all others, that you never know who the person in front of you truly is. The beggar in the mud might be a duchess, and it should not matter one whit either way because you helped them just the same. Think back on where we started, a basket of eggs bursting in the mud, a crowd laughing, an old woman on her knees in the filth with a coin thrown at her back, and not one person willing to be shamed by helping her. That is where every good and every terrible thing in this story began. One woman decided the mockery of a crowd meant less to her than the fear in a stranger's eyes. She had nothing to gain and everything to lose, and she knelt down anyway. She lost her work that night. She thought she'd lost everything. And instead she'd given the one gift that couldn't be bought in 3 counties, and set loose something that reached farther than she ever knew, into a cold man's frozen heart, into a dying woman's last good year, into a town that learned to be a little bit ashamed of its own cruelty. So the next time the whole world seems set on being unkind, and being kind will cost you something, and no one is watching and no one will ever know. Remember Prudence Hartwell, on her knees in the mud, gathering broken eggs for a stranger whose name she never asked. You never know who is watching, and in the end, it was never about who was watching at all.